Hey everybody, welcome. I'm super excited to be here. This is the first conference I've been to in person since the pandemic started. How many of you are in a similar boat as me? A lot of hands? All right. So, I've been feeling like weird as I've been seeing this many humans in 3D, so apologize if I come off as like weird and aloof. It's just a weird new world we're finding ourselves in. Let's see. There we go. Do I have something else to say? Oh yeah. I wanted something else to say. This is also kind of a special conference. This is the first conference that was put together bolts and nuts by the GraphQL Foundation. So that's actually pretty cool. That was one of the original goals of creating the foundation, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. Was running these kind of open and neutral events. So this is kind of the first example of that. Obviously, we started in a rough spot in forming the foundation in 2019, and 2020 is going to be the year that we're going to start our event strategy. Didn't really work out. So anyway, welcome. I hope this goes well. And then also, it's pretty cool to come together. I don't know if you know this, but GraphQL turned 10 years old this year, which is pretty wild. So I guess I've been kind of at this for a while. It makes me feel a little bit old. But I feel really grateful. I've gotten to work on this technology that's had a pretty interesting impact across a lot of people and a really long time. But the thing I feel most proud about is sort of building this really awesome core community that helps make GraphQL great, many of which are here. Thank you for being here. I know many others are tuning in live. You're going to get to hear from plenty of them later today, so I won't steal their thunder. But I should introduce myself. So for those of you I haven't met yet, my name is Lee. I'm one of the creators of GraphQL and the executive director of the GraphQL Foundation. So 10 years into GraphQL, I've changed a fair bit myself. So this is actually a picture of me back in 2012 when I was young and spry working at Facebook, where along with Dan Schaefer and Nick Schrock, put together the first version of GraphQL after many, many long nights. This is something a little bit more recent. So I've aged a little bit, but like significantly more so in the last few years because I got a family and these two very busy little boys. The little one there just started walking, so I'm in for it. So anyway, I've had to learn to be kind of judicious with my time. And in fact, that's a huge reason behind why I started the GraphQL Foundation in the first place. It was kind of an attempt to scale myself. I wanted to create some resiliency around GraphQL, especially the contributing community, and make sure that the time that I do have to support the project is best spent and well leveraged. And actually, very happy to say that's gone largely to plan. And I'm also super grateful to Robinhood, where I've been working for the last 4 years and supporting my role in GraphQL and the open source community at large. But I have some news here, which is my time at Robinhood is actually coming to an end pretty soon. And I'm going to be joining this new company called Watershed. So I'm going to help lead their product engineering team. I'm super excited about this. Many of you probably haven't heard of Watershed. My hope is to change that, not just for the folks in the room, but for the industry-wide. Watershed's a company that builds tools for other companies to measure and reduce their carbon footprint. So I actually think that climate change is going to be the most critical challenge of the next generation, not crypto, but climate change. And so if I've learned anything from my engineering career so far, it's that you can't move a metric that you don't track, and you can't move it very fast or very far without good tools. So Watershed is addressing both of these needs to help companies face head-on the measurement and reduction of their carbon footprint. And we need to grow really fast to do that. So I'm going to start here in a couple of weeks. And if this mission sounds like it resonates with you, and you like GraphQL and TypeScript, you should come talk to me because we're trying to find the best web engineers we can find so we can grow really quickly. Come talk to me or drop me a message if that sounds interesting to you. But anyway, enough about me. I'll get off my high horse. Before we get into the deep dive talks today and tomorrow, I just wanted to spend a few minutes kind of setting the stage for where we are, where GraphQL is today, and where better to start than the beginning. So I thought what might be most interesting was to first tell the story of the initial conditions that led us to build GraphQL in the first place, and that was Facebook's move to mobile. So Facebook was actually originally built for the web, didn't have any mobile component. And actually our first mobile components were just wrappers around our website. So we technically had iOS and Android apps. They were just wrappers around our mobile website. But this was an intentional strategy. You know, we really bet big on the web for a good reason. Because I remember when Steve Jobs got on stage to introduce the iPhone back in 2007, and he called it a breakthrough internet communication device. And it's got Safari, the best web browser in the world, and it's all on the iPhone. It was like literally one of the three things. He was like, it's an iPod. And we're like, woohoo, we love iPods. We're like, it's a phone. And we're like, whoa, Apple made a phone. He's like, and it's for the internet. And I was like, hell yeah, I'm a web engineer. This is going to be awesome. And then the next year, Google was like, okay, you all heard about this iPhone. Where's my G phone? And they talked about this whole strategy that they had acquired Android, and they're going to be rolling this out. And I was like, yes, this is great. We're going to have these two companies that have built all these amazing things for the web, and they're going to compete to build the best mobile web experience. And we're going to build the best mobile web experience, too. And no, we were pretty wrong. So 5 years later, Apple had put all of its energy into native apps and had left mobile Safari basically to rot. It was years behind at web standards and had a ton of bugs. Google hadn't even bothered. They watched what the iPhone was doing, and they just didn't even put Chrome on Android for years. So the early days of mobile web was really rocky. And Mark went on stage in front of a big conference and straight up said that our bet on the mobile web was a mistake. And he was right. And at the same time, it was clear that this transition to mobile devices, and in particular native mobile apps, was just happening way faster than we anticipated it would. And this was also the year when Facebook did their IPO. And one of the top risks, so when you go IPO, you file this thing called an S1. And it's where you list out every single thing that could doom your company. It's called your S1 risks. And one of the very first ones was this whole thing of an acknowledgement about the whole industry shifting to mobile and how Facebook had no answer to this. And this could just, totally topple the company. So we knew we were in trouble. And failure to adjust to these kind of major shifts in the past has definitely crippled and killed other major companies. So, we kind of understood that these circumstances were not academic, they were not theoretical, they were very real. So we decided to build Newsfeed, which is the very first thing that you see when you open Facebook, as a native iOS view backed by a RESTful API. And we immediately encountered some issues. So it was slow. We had to coordinate a whole host of network requests going back and forth to make up the Newsfeed work. And this was in an era where 3G networks were the key. Not 5G is pretty good. 3G was pretty slow. So this was really painful. And they were also really fragile. So, okay, network speeds get faster over time, but some of the relationships between how engineers work together, they don't change quite as fast. So changes to the API needed to be carefully carried over to client code. Otherwise, the app would just crash. This would happen a lot. And the client-side engineers were looking at the API documentation and was like, that's what the docs say. And it's like the server doesn't actually do what the docs say. We heard all about that from Rachel earlier. Very real problem. And it was also very tedious. So client work was often totally blocked on deploying new changes to the server. And anytime the API needed to change, you'd have to go through this whole sort of blocking thing where, oh, we want to do this thing, but we can't get started until the server ships their new thing and they're not ready yet. It was really, really slow to get stuff done. So anyway, these issues in mind, we took this first principles approach, the perspective of our product engineers, a prototype that we had called Supergraph, and decided to rethink established best practices. I think Ben meant this as a slight, but I like this. So this, of course, is what led us to GraphQL. So this helped us solve a bunch of the problems that we had with RESTful APIs. It's fast, not slow, fast. Since you describe everything that you need up front, there's just one round trip to the network for all the data that you need. It's robust rather than fragile because you describe all the things that you could do with the schema, and then clients just describe the subset of those that they actually need to populate a particular view, no more, no less. And so it's pretty resilient. And that opens up this whole host of superpowers that these days we kind of take for granted, but at the time are a huge deal. Like, for example, static analysis locally. You can tell if your query is good or bad, not just when you run it, but before you even check it in. So you can do things like linters and unit tests and keep code that breaks things out of master. Fantastic. And on the server, you could make sure that any changes to your types are statically checked. So if you make a breaking change, then similarly, you can catch that before you check it in, or at least if you decide to check it in, you kind of know what you're in for. And this ends up being really empowering because clients are describing what they need, and that means that they're rarely blocked by the server. And this means that GraphQL APIs never need to version. So we've got some Meta folks here in the room that can check me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that this means that a decade later, Facebook, Meta, is still on version 1 of its GraphQL API. Technology's evolved a lot, but it's never needed to like major bump a version. So pair this with the static types, and now you have this really cool platform for building tools. Code generation, API explorers, IDE integration, lots of really awesome stuff. Whoops. I went too fast on my arrows there. Documentation, also, first-class citizen. We heard from Rachel earlier about how important it is to keep your documentation up to date with your implementation, and we baked that directly into the type system so that documentation is actually available in code, and so code generating tools can actually lift this up and put them in the right places. And it was actually fairly easy to adopt because in the first couple of years, GraphQL out there, everyone thought it was some new database language, and I already have a database, don't make me use a new database. It's like, we're not doing databases. It's just arbitrary code, just like a REST API. You write a REST API endpoint, you just query arbitrary code underneath. That's what we're doing too. And this was great because it meant that it could be adopted super fast. The newsfeed team took up the first version of GraphQL very quickly, and it spread pretty virally across the rest of Facebook, really driven by product engineers. So anyway, towards the end of 2012, we released this new iOS app powered by GraphQL and have been on a similar path ever since. Plenty of evolution, still GraphQL under the hood. So at the same time, the group was working on another project that was React. And the next year at JSConf, we open sourced React. And this has turned into, of course, one of Meta's most important open source projects, and really was the highlight of just what open source could mean to the company. We had open sourced a handful of things before, but they didn't really have the impact that this had. So we were really excited, and a little bit later, a couple years later, some of my teammates gave this talk at a React.js conference talking about Relay. We've got a bunch of Relay folks in the room. And this was the very first time we talked about Relay publicly, and it brought together React and GraphQL. And the audience was like, this is amazing. Are you going to open source it? We can't use it. And it was like, the goal was not like, yeah, we're open sourcing this thing today. It was, we just wanted to like kind of talk about how we were solving this data fetching problem. But we were so inspired by the reaction that we got. They're like, maybe we should open source Relay. That would be great. But you can't really open source Relay without also open sourcing GraphQL. Does it even make sense to do that? Like, what does it even mean to open source GraphQL? So I'll admit, like, I was actually the person in the room that was like, no, this is a bad idea. Like, I don't think it makes any sense. I was pretty skeptical. I didn't know if notable companies would really use this, if it would be a big waste of time. And also, it wasn't really clear what it would even mean to open source it, because GraphQL was just a bunch of PHP code like interwoven throughout Facebook's core systems. So maybe we could extract that into a library, but even if we did, we'd end up with a PHP library, and there weren't a ton of other companies using PHP, so I'm not sure that that would gain a ton of traction. But anyway, we decided what actually made GraphQL great was the idea, the interface and the language, and less so the actual specific implementation. So we wrote a specification that described GraphQL with the hope that this would lead to other implementations. And we wrote the first of those, and that was GraphQL.js, which we hoped would get a little bit more traction than PHP. I think that was a fair bet. And later that year, we announced GraphQL as an open source project. We shared the specification and the implementation with the community, and asked them to, hey, read the spec, and if this is interesting, build it for your language too. And by the end of that year, so like this was, I think, August 2015, and 3 months later, there were already 6 major projects in the work to port GraphQL to other languages. So very impressive. And today, I'm pretty sure you can find GraphQL implemented in 24 languages, which sounds crazy. That's a lot. Like, are there even that many languages people are using to build stuff? Yes, most of them are being used in production by various companies. Pretty wild. And the GraphQL community, it started as hobbyists. A lot of the people who were building that stuff were just people who thought this was cool. But very quickly, it started to get used by real companies. So we saw early adopters like the New York Times, Walmart, Intuit, Airbnb, Netflix, Twitter, Amazon, GitHub, and actually a bunch more. So this has just grown and grown. And we saw our community really grow. So I grabbed the screenshot from Meetup a couple of years ago, and it's not to say these are all the meetups today. This was like in 2017. These were the amount of meetups that were specifically talking about GraphQL on some cadence. This is really awesome. And now also there's, of course, many GraphQL-specific conferences across the world, not just this one. There are many. Some of you have probably been to a couple of those. So frankly, all of this is still kind of incredible to me. I'm really impressed by this. And I'm very happy to say that my early skepticism was completely unwarranted. But we still face some problems. So turns out, we had filed a bunch of patents back around the very beginning of the GraphQL project, and patent office takes a while, and it's a little black box. And 5 years later, they came out and be like, hurrah, here's your patents. And the open source community loves patents. And meanwhile, there's this whole rigmarole over the React was using this modified BSD license, and a bunch of people were pretty grumpy about that. And GraphQL code was also using that. The spec itself just didn't have a license. I think technically it had a BSD license. Doesn't mean anything for a spec. So we're just in this weird spot. We started getting people who actually knew what they were doing. The person who wrote this particular article is a copyright lawyer, so he knows what he's talking about when he says that we're not doing it right. So after learning way more than I really cared to about open source law and having to make friends with our legal team, I got this resolved. So we relicensed the spec under a more friendly license that included explicit grants. All of our code got relicensed as MIT, and the same person who wrote, they added this update, and he said, hurrah, I now definitely feel comfortable recommending GraphQL for all uses. So great, okay, this problem is solved, but I started to get this feeling in the back of my head that GraphQL was starting to outgrow its corporate ownership model and might eventually need a life outside of Facebook. So a couple years later, after I had left Facebook myself, I formed the GraphQL Foundation as an open and neutral owner of GraphQL. It owns its code and artifacts, as well as patents, licenses, trademarks, all that good stuff. But what exactly is this thing? What's the GraphQL Foundation, and what does it do? So the mission of the foundation is to accelerate the development of the GraphQL ecosystem and enable widespread adoption. And it does that in two really important ways. First, we want to create a space for companies to come together and collaborate to advance community initiatives. And then second, we want to host forums and processes for making sure that the GraphQL standards and technical projects themselves are moving at a fast clip. And there's a handful of ways that we do this. There's sort of three major groups of people that help make the foundation work. The first is our member board. So the member board is full of companies that join the GraphQL Foundation and contribute financially. They also take action on community initiatives. For example, this event is hosted in large part thanks to the contributions of our members. And they also make decisions. So they contribute financially, and they also get to vote and decide how to leverage that shared pool of resources. So in 2009, when I was getting the foundation together, I was just talking to folks that I know were using GraphQL or building services that help people use GraphQL, and said, hey, come do this with me. And I got a handful of them to say, yeah, sounds awesome. And these were most of our founding members. We got Facebook, AWS, IBM, Intuit, Neo4j is still in there, Salsify, Apollo, Hasura. And this kept growing. So today we've got 28 member companies. In fact, just in the last couple of months, this grew from 25 to 28. So we're still growing really quickly. And the vast majority of these are not just financial backers. They're really proactive contributors. They're doing stuff. They're showing up to board meetings. They're taking action. And this is fantastic. And I would love to see this number keep going up. So if you work somewhere and you care about GraphQL, the financial contribution here is not huge. It's meant to be very accessible because we want people who care about this to come work with us. So companies contribute financially, but I kind of wanted to really avoid a pay-to-play situation. So earlier in my career, I was one of Facebook's delegates to the TC39, the JavaScript body, and that was this pay-to-play. So there was a bunch of moments that felt really awkward where someone in the community had fantastic ideas, and we wanted to bring them in, and there was just all this insane rules on how to get a clearly brilliant person with a great idea with enthusiasm to show up and represent that idea. It just didn't feel right. So I didn't want us to end up in that similar situation. So we have this working group. Working group is an open attendance group, and this supports the continuous development of the spec and our core technical projects. And in fact, most of the speakers you'll hear from today and tomorrow either are or at some point have been a part of this group. But actually, this working group predated the foundation. So back in 2016 was less than a year after open sourcing GraphQL. We had the very first dedicated GraphQL conference. There's about 350 people. Totally nuts to me that the very first dedicated conference happened so quickly. But at this conference, I gave the closing talk, and I announced sort of, big boy shoes for GraphQL. We were going to take on a couple more kind of heavyweight procedures to make sure the technology was going to evolve well. That included an RFC process for managing changes and a monthly open invite meeting that anyone could come to. We had done a couple of them kind of ad hoc as we needed them, but this would give a little bit more continuity and availability for folks who wanted to help out. These were the origins of our working group. So really our working group goes back almost 6 years, which is pretty wild. So when we created the foundation, I wanted to make sure that that group felt very well supported. So we did a collaboration with this the small group called the Joint Development Foundation. Most of what they do is they just build the kind of infrastructure for running these kinds of things, so really legal frameworks and things like that. So they gave us all the appropriate legal frameworks and all the tools and procedures necessary to operate a standards body from a legal perspective. And here we are. So 6 weeks later, our working group remains open and free to join for everyone. The attendance and the ongoing work in these meetings somehow seems to keep accelerating. Like you'd think 6 years later, like maybe it would have peaked and trailed off, but no. This is the one that we had literally last week, and I counted, we had 24 attendees, and that's not atypical. This is a common meeting, is to have roughly 24 people. We had a packed agenda. The meeting went 2 hours long. We actually had to bump one thing to the next month talk. In addition to this, we have subcommittees. There's just a ton of really, really interesting work going on to advance GraphQL. You're welcome to join these. They're free and open, but in addition to this, we record them all. This is actually a screenshot from a YouTube video. We post all of them on YouTube. We also take extensive notes, and this is, in fact, Benji, our resident community maintainer and note taker, who I don't have no idea how he does it, but has himself overlaid over the notes in every meeting. It's fantastic. The final group that makes up the foundation is our technical steering committee. And in many other foundations, this group has a lot of responsibility. But because the working group predated it, the working group really takes on the vast majority of technical responsibility. So the TSC is really more of like a formal body. These are the administrators. So if something pops up that needs administrative help, the TSC is there to help that out. You can kind of think of this as like the core maintainer group for a project, where you might have like a whole broad set of people contributing and maintaining, but there's like a tight, narrowly defined group who are the core and who have sort of extra permissions. As I mentioned before, I'm a fairly new dad, and so I've had to learn to be very judicious with my time. So before, it was like I was kind of the GraphQL admin, and sometimes something would pop up and I'd be busy and wouldn't be able to jump in and help. And so the TSC has been a fantastic way to scale myself. These people help manage our core projects, help merge pull requests, they organize our working group meetings, they stay atop a ton of issues. I'm very, very pleased to have such a fantastic group to lean on. And they're also responsible anytime we need to take a vote on something, which we very, very rarely need to do. Almost everything we do by consensus, but every once in a while we need to do a vote. And one thing that actually has a legal requirement to do a vote is ratifying our spec. And last fall, we did exactly that. We ratified the very first version of the GraphQL spec, and it's governed by all of the above. We got updated licenses, contribution model defined by the JDF, an editorial and ratification process guided by our TSC, and like this is all music to my specky, wonky brain, but you probably care less about that and more about what's in it. Kind of a lot, but also not that much, like about 100 changes by 35 contributors, not too bad. Highlights include custom scalars, repeatable and order significant directives, updates to how we do interfaces, and a bunch of parser ambiguities that we fixed. So this might feel a little underwhelming, like we did a spec release and there was no new major, like, whoa, an incredible new feature. But to me, this actually seems right. This feels good. Because at 10 years old, GraphQL really needs to feel stable. Because other technology, companies, and services are built on top of it, and those need to thrive. So frequent changes may be exciting for us core developers, but if it creates a ton of thrash across the ecosystem, that's not a good thing. So I've actually been thinking about the phase that we're in now a bit more, and remembering back to that first GraphQL conference from 2016. And in that talk, I shared that less than a year after open sourcing, I was really surprised by how well things were going and how I had actually kind of written down some predictions of what I thought might happen with some like rough dates as to when I thought they would happen. And I called it the GraphQL Secret Master Plan for World Domination. So I've revisited this a few times, so if you've seen one of my talks, you might recognize this slide. But just to kind of recap, the first few months was like, all right, we're going to get hobbyists and some personal projects, and that was looking pretty accurate. I was happy with that. But then we like whizzed down the list really fast. So I thought that was going to take about 2 years to see GraphQL implemented in 10 languages. But this actually happened in slightly less than 1 year. So very, very impressive. And today, of course, they're close to 2 dozen. Around the 2-year mark, we had this like very large and growing list of tech giants and Fortune 500 companies, all not just using it, but like publicly talking about how they were using GraphQL. And in the year since, that's continued to grow really rapidly. So the previous times I've talked about this, I said, maybe the next thing is ubiquity. And I said before, I don't know if I really know how to define that or what that means, but I kind of think maybe we're there. GraphQL is used by tens of thousands of companies. It's leveraged by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of developers. There's an ecosystem of dozens of different companies who are building first-class developer tools for GraphQL. And there's multiple annual GraphQL conferences, dozens, if not hundreds of meetups. And GraphQL tends to be an ongoing topic at general developer conferences as well. So that's it. We're done, right? Like, pack it up and go home? Nope. I think we have more challenges ahead. Just because we're broadly used doesn't mean that we rest on our laurels. We now have, I think, 2 really big problems ahead of us. And I think what you'll see in the talks over the next couple of days are going to fit into these 2 categories, either foraying into evolving needs or settling into sort of a mature domain. And the first is that we really need to keep evolving with technology. I'm convinced that the core of GraphQL itself is pretty evergreen, much like how SQL is still in pretty frequent use, despite being well over 50 years old. But just as variants of SQL have evolved quite a lot in that time, so must GraphQL. And GraphQL is built with front-end developers, client-side engineers in mind. And the one thing we know for sure is that web and mobile tech stacks are rapidly evolving. And so as they do, we have to keep our eyes out for emerging problems and see how or if GraphQL can help them face those. Then we need to continue to mature the tools and services that ease the adoption and successful use of GraphQL in production. Pretty much every year that I talk about GraphQL, I say I always have underestimated just how hard it is and how important it is to invest in really good tools. So I actually think some of the most important work going on in the GraphQL space are the developer companies who are building high-powered tools for GraphQL. I think that's really critical to establish GraphQL as a mature and stable technology. So here we are. Again, super thrilled to be kicking off this for everyone who's here in person. Thank you for being here and everyone who's tuning in live. As you can tell, I'm really proud of the GraphQL Foundation and what it's let us do over the last few years. I think it only gets better as more people show up to help participate. So again, if you use GraphQL, if your company uses GraphQL, I would love to see you participate. I would love to see your company on our list of members. You can go here, graphql.org/foundation, to learn more about the foundation and how to participate, or feel free to shoot me a message. I'm always available on Twitter. So anyway, I hope everyone has a great next couple of days, and thank you for being here with me.